Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to able to welcome Dr. Jon Greenberg to a Zoom lecture for our community, and we see some people joining from outside as well. We're glad to be able to provide this opportunity for our members and I guess people all over the world. Dr. Greenberg is a biblical and Talmudic ethnobotanist. It's probably a bigger word than I can say that I know what it really means. But we're pleased to have him join us to share some insights on the Hagadah, some things from his new Hagadah labeled Fruits of Freedom, I can't even read this, unfortunately. What does it say here? Pre-Cherut, is that it?
Right.
And the title of tonight's topic is Hillel's Burrito, the Spanish Pesach Bunny, and the Pomegranates from the Sea, Seder Gems from Fruits of Freedom, the Torah Flora Hagadah, and maybe if we're lucky, we'll even get some behind the scenes. Things that didn't make it into the book and the and extra tidbits. So thank you. We're wonderful. Glad to have a great turnout. And thank you, everyone. I'm sure Dr. Greenberg will leave time for questions at the end or throughout, however he wants to run that. And thank you for joining us. Without further ado.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Friedberg, and everybody at Young Israel there for hosting this program. Really happy to be able to share this information with you. I think you're going to find this very entertaining, and probably most of this is things that you have not seen elsewhere. It took about 4 years to write this Haggadah, and a lot of it was digging out details and figuring out how the obscure statements in Chazal fit together with the scientific information, historical information, and what was really behind this. And there were a lot of surprises along the way. So I'm going to first take just a couple of minutes to show you a little bit about the book per se, the book as a book, and then we'll get into what's actually in it. So there are several themes I wanted to bring out in this book, and you can see some of this. Let's start with the cover, because I think this represents a lot of it. Here we go. Okay, good. So here's the cover of the book. And you can see ancient agriculture in Egypt at the bottom. You can see people collecting grapes and processing them into wine, collecting fish from artificial ponds, bread, and everything is being collected in the middle panel for the pharaoh and the queen at the left to be presented to them. At the top, you see the outcome of this today, which is 2 Israeli farmers working in their fields today in Israel. So the idea was to get information from the history of Jewish food and agriculture to help illuminate and help us to better understand a lot of points in the Haggadah that may be obscure. So because I drew on a lot of different areas for this, figuring out who I wanted to look at it was sort of a challenge. And this may be a little too small to read, I don't know. But what I wanted to show you here is that the cover blurbs in the back are from a very wide variety of people. We have from the top, Nigel Savage, who was the founder of Chazon, a Jewish environmentalist organization, Rabbi Menachem Ganak, executive director of OU Kosher, Erica Brown, some of you may have heard of. Let's see, Joan Nathan, an authority on Jewish food and food history. Ed Bez is not Jewish. He is the president of the Biblical Botanical Garden Society and is very interested in this sort of thing. Or David Foreman, you're familiar with him probably, many of you are. Joanne Gardner wrote another biblical botany book. Zohar Amar is not as well known in this country. He is a professor of biblical botany, I guess you'd say, in Israel, actually in Department of Land of Israel Studies and Archaeology at Bar-Ilan. He is the specialist who's called in when archaeological digs in Israel unearth textiles and identifying fibers and dyes, and he's interested in Roman period and early Islamic medicinal plants as well. And finally, Levana Kirschenbaum, another Jewish food person, founder of Levana Restaurant, the first really sophisticated restaurant in New York, so kosher restaurant in New York. So the intention here was to get a wide variety of people who could look at all the different aspects of this book that it involves. Another thing that I decided I wanted to do was I wanted to make it accessible so that people with even a very basic knowledge of the Seder and of Pesach would understand what I was saying. And then for those who are more learned and want more details, you can see the footnotes at the bottom are there. This is an interesting sort of typical example of footnotes at the bottom of a page. You can see of the first 4, these are all from Chazal, Rav Amram, Rishon, 3 references to Gemara, and then a Latin poem, 2 Latin poems, a book on the history of Italian food, a United Nations report on new crops. There's a Shakespeare reference, number 55, And the last one's a scientific paper about why some people hate the taste of cilantro. Turns out it's genetic. Okay, so it's a lot of different kind of areas of knowledge that I was trying to pull together to make sense of all this. And I think that's what you have to do with these things, is to try and see it in its full context, the natural setting, the agricultural setting, the food setting, and the rabbinic writings from that period that kind of pull it all together and give us a full picture of what the meaning of some of these practices is. One of the things that came out of the research for this is that many things that we do, we've been doing for a very long time at the Seder, for many centuries, but in many cases, the reasons that people believe they were doing them have changed. So there's a feature throughout the book with little green shading, and it says, what does it mean? This one happened to be on Karpas, outlining sort of some of the different meanings people have given to some of these practices. So Karpas at different times has been held to mean different things, and the plants that are used have been used for different reasons. The photo above there may be sort of strange. That's actually a cross-section of a banana plant that's been cut, and you can see a new sprout is coming up in the center of the roll of leaves, but it's meant to illustrate that a banana plant is a roll of leaves. It's not really a tree. There is no woody trunk there. And therefore, its bracha is Borei Priya Dama, not Priya Eitz. So this particular feature talks about how Rabbi Priel of Elizabeth, New Jersey, popularized the use of bananas for karpas in order to teach people 120 years ago, when bananas were rare in the north, that that was the correct bracha for this. We thought that was the way to do it. Recent immigrants from Eastern Europe who weren't familiar with bananas. So that's part of the whole story of karpas. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight. So that's about the book itself. Let me give you now, before we get into the slide, a little background, some of the stories I want to tell you from the actual, what's in the book, okay? So this is sort of an interesting one, and we're going to see it as a counterpart in other areas of the Seder as well. It has to do with the choice of vegetables for maror. Now that in itself could be an hour lecture, but I'm not going to do that tonight. As many of you probably know, it's very clear from the Gemara that the ideal choice is lettuce. We usually use romaine lettuce because it's a little bit bitter. And the Gemara explains why. Because if you leave it in the ground past the point where you usually harvest it, it will continue to grow and mature and become slowly more and more bitter. It accumulates a mildly narcotic bitter compound called lactusin, which can actually put people to sleep if they are eating it along with 4 cups of wine. And the Gemara actually discusses at one point in Arvei Pesachim, the chapter on the Seder, what do you do if you fall asleep after eating before you bench? What do you do when you wake up? Do you say Birkat HaMazon, or is Hefsech Hadad and it's not possible? And it comes up all of a sudden in a sugi. You wonder, what is this doing here? This belongs in brachot, not in Pesachim. The answer is, I think, by the time you get to Birkat HaMazon, you've already had 2 cups of wine and a significant quantity of this lettuce, which in those days was quite much stronger and more narcotic. And so they were really mixing alcohol and drugs and passing it out at the table. And this was the concern. What do you do when you wake up from this? Do I bench or not? But the primary ideal one to use, of course, is lettuce. When Jews moved farther north and east in Europe in the Middle Ages, they couldn't get lettuce or any other green thing like that early in the spring. And so as a last resort, they resorted to cold-tolerant roots such as horseradish, which is not really bitter. It's sharp, and it's not, there's none of the criteria that the Gemara requires for lettuce. Now, why is this significant here? So the Gemara's explanation is that it gradually gets bitter is that it's meant to be parallel to our experience in Egypt. As the Gemara says, Tichilat Torah v'sofo mar. In the beginning, it was sweet, and in the end, it was gentle, it was mild, and in the end, it was bitter. Referring to our initial stay in Egypt in the time of Yosef, which was great. We had the favor of the Pharaoh, we got the best land and the top jobs of the government, and everything was great. And then slowly things began to deteriorate. This in part reflects the likelihood that Yosef's Pharaoh was probably a Hyksos Pharaoh. He was from Canaan or somewhere close to there. And these northerners had invaded the Nile Delta and taken control of it, established their own Pharaoh there. Eventually, the native Egyptians revolted and pushed these people out of the country. All foreigners were caught, killed, or enslaved, and the Jews had backed the wrong horse, and now we were in trouble. right? Vayakam melech hadash shelo yadat Yosef, right? The new Pharaoh didn't know about Yosef because he was on the other side. Okay, so the idea is that we were gradually embittered there, and therefore, because the lettuce plant gradually becomes bitter, it reflects the slow, insidious encroachment of anti-Semitism or of oppression, not what those of us like me who grew up with horseradish experienced, and we were either told or inferred on our own. The point of maror is to compress 200 years of slavery into 30 seconds, so your head blows off, and that's what it was like. The Gemara is very clear this is not the point of maror. It actually points out that someone thought that it was and tried to collect marir ta, the most bitter herb he could find, and his colleagues told him, remember, we learned this drasha that it's like lettuce, right? Why do we use chasa? Because tchilat torach v'sof omar. So that possibility, that sort of the image we have with horseradish, was rejected. Now, what happens later? So the Rishonim later begin to make lists as Jews moved out of the Middle East into other areas, North Africa and Europe. In many cases, they lost the tradition of what plants to use, or they resorted to locally available plants. And many of the Rishonim talk about plants they think you can use for maror. The Ravya has a very interesting comment. The Ravya now is a medieval German Rishon. He has a whole list, mostly copied from the Mishnah, of in descending order of preferability. First of all, lettuce. If you can't get lettuce, go to endive. If you can't get endive, go to the next one on the list. He goes down the list. And at the end of the list, he's added on something new that he calls Wermut. Wermut. That's German. It means worm, like worm. And ut is wood, wormwood. So what he's talking about is wormwood. And here we have a picture of it. This is a toxic plant in the Middle East. It is a pasture weed. This one is an ornamental variety you can grow around your house if you like. There's also a variety that's found in Europe that was used to flavor absinthe, which is a toxic liquor that was banned in the late 1800s. It's making a comeback now, cleaned up, but it contains a toxin from this plant that was causing brain damage in 19th century French artists who like to drink this all the time. So why is he throwing in this new one to use this wormwood instead of lettuce for maror? So there's a reason for this. Wormwood in biblical Hebrew is lana. Didn't recognize that? It's in Sefer Devarim. Pore rosh velana, right? It's talking about someone who tries to entice other Jews into idolatry. It's a toxic plant. Flowering with rosh is just any kind of medicinal or poisonous plant, and lana, that wormwood. So what's the significance of it there? Why is this the metaphor for avodah zarah? Remember, at this time, what was the parnas of the Jewish people? They were nomadic shepherds. Right? Now, if you're a shepherd in those dry areas, you have to keep moving around because there's not enough vegetation in one place to have a stationary ranch. And if you discover that the area where your animals are grazing is infested with wormwood, they will eat it, and it can kill them. They don't distinguish it. So you have to leave that area. So a little bit of wormwood is making the entire pasture unusable. It's the old one bad apple spoils the barrel kind of situation. So that's the metaphor the Torah is using there. This person introduces something toxic into Jewish society, avodah zarah, all right, and it begins to contaminate everything, and he ruins the whole community by bringing people into this. But that has nothing to do with maror. Maror was supposed to be about the slow, insidious encroachment of enslavement and anti-Semitism. How do we get from that to avodah zarah? And back up a little. Remember, avadim hayinu, the big theme of the Haggadah, was one of two choices. Right? The Gemara says in the Magid, when we're going to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, we begin with we matchil b'gnai u'mesayem b'shvach. We begin with shame and end with glory. So what's the shame? Two opinions. Avadim hayinu, right? Page number. Oh, sure. When I get some pictures, sure. That picture I just showed, if you wanted to see that, was on page 37, 38. Someone asked for those page references. Okay, so one alternative for the shame is avadim hayinu, where we're embarrassed that our ancestors were slaves and not royalty that we can brag about. Second alternative, ovdei elilim hayu avotenu, right? That our ancestors were idol worshippers. So we're embarrassed about that. The primary one in the Magid is Avadim Hayinu. That's clearly the main one. But there's also this other one that surfaces in a few small places. What the Rabia has done by switching Maror from a symbol of the encroachment of enslavement to a symbol of Avodah Zarah corrupting a Jewish community is he's completely reversed the meaning of Maror by choosing a different vegetable. He's changed it from look what these Egyptians did to us to look what we did, right? It's about our own sins. And the most fascinating footnote to this, you can almost darshan on his talk there. He says, if you can't find any lettuce, then you can use wormwood. So what does he mean by that? If you don't have lettuce here was the symbol of oppression by non-Jews. If you don't have lettuce, if you are blessed to live in a historical setting where you don't suffer from this and you can live openly as a Jew and you can learn Torah and you can practice mitzvot and no one's stopping you, you don't have maror, you don't have lettuce, you now need to think about lana. You need to think about your own actions, right? So it's switching the agency to us. It's not saying that we caused the enslavement, but it is saying if you're blessed to be in that situation, you don't have that problem, right? No one's oppressing you. So now you need to consider your own actions. You have no one to blame but yourself for any sins that you may claim you're pressured into. So he's completely reversed the meaning by switching the vegetable. Now, this also has a counterpart in the wine. Those who are looking at pages in the Hagadah, this is pages 111 to 112. So we need to get a little background for this first. The Gemara discussing the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups, says it's preferable to use red wine, particularly for the 4 cups of Pesach, of the Seder. All right. This comes down to the Shulchan Aruch, which says you should use red wine. It's preferable to use red wine. The Ramah equivocates a little bit. He says, well, if you can get white wine that's of a better quality than the red wine available to you, then you should use the superior one, even if it's white. It's interesting why these 2 authorities chose these different opinions. I think it has a lot to do with their environment, which we're going to see in a minute. Now, the Taz, the Torei Zahav, lived a little bit later, but his commentary from very early time has always been reprinted with the Shulchan Aruch. Taz lived in Poland in the 16th century, and he talks about the red and white wine there. He says, this is interesting how this disappeared. He said, everyone here, meaning in Poland, everyone here, of course, uses white wine for the Seder. Now, I would imagine there's some people here whose ancestors came to America from Poland. Does anyone have that tradition in their family to use white wine going back to Poland for the Seder? I'm not hearing any yeses. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. No, this disappeared. This is the 16th century, he was saying this. What was this all about? So the reason that he cites is because of the blood libel, right? So the concern was that when you open the door for Eliyahu holding the 3rd cup, and the neighbors, if you have non-Jewish neighbors, peek in, and if they are so inclined to see you saying strange things in a foreign language, or if you don't speak Hebrew when you're saying it in the vernacular, what are you saying at that point? Shvoch hamacha, pour out your wrath on the nations of the world who would devour the nation of Israel. And you're holding cups of something red in your hand. And the blood libel was all over Poland in the 16th century. You're really asking for it, right? What do you think they're going to think, right? So he says, if this is your situation, use white wine. Now, as time went by, the blood libel disappeared from Poland, and we don't worry about this anymore. However, there are people who needed to worry about this a little more. And here we're going to see who they are. Okay, now here is a map of Germany and France showing red and white wine growing areas. Red grape growing areas for wine grapes in red. The white wine areas in yellow. You can see it's primarily in the river valleys of southern Germany that the white wines, the sweet white wines, became popular. Red primarily in France, except in eastern France. So the area in eastern France there near the German border, that's Alsace-Lorraine. That's why it has a French and a German name. The capital is Strasbourg. You can recognize the German Berg in that name. That's a white wine growing area. So the Jews of Alsace have a custom to use white wine for the 3rd cup. That's the one where you open the door, right? Because It's a white wine growing area, and regional pride being what it is. Everybody in town drinks white wine. It's very unusual to see red wine in anybody's house. And now you're opening the door with a cup of something red. And cousin Francois, who never learned Hebrew, is saying in French, what do you think they're going to think, right? So there is a custom to this day among some Alsatian Jews to use white wine for the third cup, specifically for that reason, even though they may use red for the others. But now we can see why the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch differ on this, right? The Ramah lived in Europe in a Christian area, and the Shulchan Aruch was composed in a Muslim environment. The blood libel was unknown in the Muslim world. It had a lot to do with Christian theology about the meaning of blood. And so it wasn't a concern for the Shulchan Aruch, but it was a potential concern for the Ramah. So he was hedging his bets and saying, let's keep the door open to white wine, because we may need that on occasion. Okay. One of the things I find fascinating about all this, that was a historical example, but when the technology also, or the science, becomes a halachic question here. So let me give you the background to this one about the matzah bakery dilemma. There are two statements in the Gemara, independent of each other, same Masechta, but in different places, that talk about what happens to the sun at night. Okay, so what is this all about? So we have a passage that talks about this just in the context of astronomy. Let's see, I'll give you it's in Pesachim. Let's see. Pesachim 94b, if anybody wants to look at it. So the discussion there is what happens to the sun at night. So at that time of the Gemara, most Jews still subscribe to the Babylonian cosmology, which is that the sky is a big inverted bowl, a big dome, blue on the inside. So when we look up, we see the blue sky. During the day, the sun slips under the edge of this onto the inside and travels across the inside of this bowl from east to west. So we see the sun against a blue background. And then at sunset, it slips out under the western edge of the bowl and goes back on the outside, so we can't see it when it's dark, to the east, and comes back in the morning. Okay. At this time, the Ptolemaic cosmology was becoming popular in Greece, especially, which held that the sun actually goes around the earth. There's no big bowl. The sun just circles around the earth. Okay, so so they're debating this, and it's remarkable. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, I think their version makes more sense than ours. Now, how can he say that the Greek version makes more sense than the Jewish version? This is not a halachic issue. This is not Torah. He's just saying, what do we think happens to the sun at night? There's no Torah issue involved here. So that's one sugya. Now, in the separate sugya in the same Masechta, Pesachim 42a, we have the issue of Mayim Shalanu. Mayim Shalanu. So if someone's maybe not familiar with the halakha issue here, what does that phrase sound like it means? Mayim Shalanu, water that's what?
That rested, slept.
Okay, Shelanu, right? Water which rested. Like lalin is to stay overnight somewhere. But if it's not written, if I'm just talking about it out of context, you might think I'm saying Mayim Shalanu, right? Our water, right? So the Gemara describes an incident where one of the rabbis in Babylonia went to a very remote town where the people were not that sophisticated or learned before Pesach, and he said to them, when you make matzah, you always have to use water, Mayim Shalanu. The next day, they came to him with buckets, and he said, "Okay, give us this our water, and we'll use it to make our matzah." He said, "No, you misunderstood. It's not Mayim Shalanu, it's Mayim Shalanu. It means you have to draw the water from the well or a river, wherever you're getting it, the day before you're going to use it, and leave it in a container overnight, ideally outdoors." It doesn't say why. Okay. Now, these were two separate sugyot. There was no obvious connection between them. Rashi comes along centuries later and says, these two stories are connected. The reason you have to bring the water, draw the water from the well the day before you're going to use it is at night, the sun goes under the earth and it warms the water from below. And so in the morning, if you take the water in the morning, when you're ready to get to work and making your matzah, it's going to be warmer. So draw the water the day before and keep it in a container overnight, and the next day it'll be cold. Some of the medieval sources give a practical explanation. They say, well, it's cold at night. It's colder at night than it is during the day. So if you have your bucket of water or your jug of water sitting outside, it's going to get cold, aside from any question about the sun going under the earth at night and warming up the springs from below. To this day, this is the halakha on the books. Every kosher, the Pesach matzah operation has a big tank where they fill it up with water the day before they use it. Most of the matzah almost all the matzah you would buy commercially today was made probably by now already in January and February, December through February in the winter. The big concrete tank, Streitz has one, Manischewitz has one, they all have a big tank. In the wintertime, they fill this thing up with water. It's outdoors. Of course, it's cold. It's big enough that it doesn't freeze overnight. And then in the morning, they have very cold water to use in making the matzah. Now, today we'd say, okay, good. So it slows down fermentation. The low temperature is good. We understand the biochemistry. That's fine. But why do you have to do it that way? Couldn't you just use cold water? What difference does it make that you drew it the day before? Here's where the problem comes up. So every certification agency, the OU, the KafK, all of them, if they're certifying matzah for Pesach, they require mayim shalanu. Problem came up in the I believe it was 1950s. Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the head of the Beit Din of the old city of Jerusalem, got a letter from Argentina. They have matzah bakery there. People wanted to make matzah for Pesach, but the problem is they would also want to make their matzah from December to February, but in Argentina, that's the height of the summer. And if they put the water outside, it's not going to get cold, it's going to get hot. So what are they supposed to do? So they asked him, what do we do? So he said, well, there are a few things you can do. First of all, you do need to take the water the day before. You must follow mayim shalanu. That's the halakha. But I'm not going to tell you that the sun is warming the water from below. You can put it in a walk-in cooler if you need to the day before. You can put ice in it. You can do anything you want to cool it. You just have to draw it the day before. But you must keep doing this. If that's not good enough for you, you can't get that to work, you can buy your matzah that was made somewhere else. And then his final conclusion, he says, well, you could move here, and when we all are in Yerushalayim in the time of Mashiach, they all mitzvot, including matzah baking, will be done as they should be in Eretz Yisrael, and we hope you will join us here soon. So he left them with that. So what he did in his talk was fascinating, because what he managed to do was to integrate a modern understanding of the science with the preservation of the halakha. He didn't change the halakha at all. He gave them ways to work with it without pretending that we have to believe that the sun is under the ground at night heating up the water. So he was able to justify, to integrate the two. Those of you looking at the Hagadah, this is pages 81 and 82 for that. Let's see, I'm running short on time. I'm going to tell one more story because it's two quick ones, and then I'll take questions. Okay. Let's see, this one, pages 66 to 67. So this one is, the people want me to do Jewish environmentalism because they think I'm talking about nature and plants and Judaism. I have to talk about environmentalism, and it's okay, but it's not my real focus here. My real focus is on using using science to illuminate Torah, and sometimes Torah to shed light on science. So I'm going to give you this story here. It's related to soil conservation. At the end of the last ice age, the entire Mediterranean was actually forested. I'm going to show you a picture of what it looked like. There's a little bit of this forest left in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And the picture on the right here shows what it looks like. Okay, this kind of a forest. This is what the whole Mediterranean looked like at that time. The picture on the left is a typical Mediterranean scene today. This was taken from the air of one of the Greek islands. You can see the exposed rock on the hillsides due to the heavy erosion of soil on those steep slopes. The reason that happened is that when people began to settle in the area as the ice receded, they began to plow. Eventually, once they invented the plow on steep hillsides, which is not a good idea, they began to cut down the trees for firewood and for building. that were protecting the soil from erosion by rain on the hillsides. And very soon the soil began to erode away. And we have today the typical Mediterranean rocky eroded landscape. You see it in Israel and Greece and Italy and in North Africa and all these Mediterranean countries. It got to the point where it was seriously endangering the ability of people to produce enough food, to the point that the Mishnah in Baba Kama, chapter 7, Mishnah 7, that says it's forbidden to raise sheep in Eretz Yisrael. Sheep, when they graze, will actually pull the grass out by the roots and leaving nothing there to hold the soil in place. And these are soil prone to erosion. All right, so you got to find some other place to grow sheep. The problem is Pesach. Everybody needs a korban Pesach. So Josephus describes how huge numbers of sheep were imported into Israel every year before Pesach, and the whole country was white with sheep. Where do they all come from? So we have a clue. Some archaeologists in Jerusalem found what they think was a garbage dump from that time, from the early Roman period, and it was full of old, charred, broken sheep bones. So there's a lot of sheep bones in one place. This is probably where they dumped the bones from the Korban Pesach when they were done with it. Now, it's possible to analyze the carbon and nitrogen isotopes in these bones and recognize where they came from. What they determined was these animals had been raised in a desert environment, and in some cases as far away as Saudi Arabia, and they were imported and sold to people for Pesach. What a fantastic thing this is, and so inspirational, really, that we can see that our ancestors were so determined, A, to preserve the land of Israel, and B, to have a Korban Pesach and celebrate Pesach as the Torah requires, that they went to these enormous lengths to import sheep, from hundreds of miles away in the Northern Arabian Peninsula, and have these sheep driven overland all the way to Israel for one meal. It's really a kind of a testament to their dedication, both to the land of Israel and to Torah, that we can take inspiration from today, that they were able to do that. Okay, the last one of these stories I'm going to share. This is a lot of fun. Some of you may know about the beginning of this story, but I think very few people know about the end of it. This is the Pesach Bunny. This is on page 26 for those who have the Hagadah. The Pesach Bunny is coming this year. What is the Pesach? The Pesach Bunny is real. So what is the Pesach Bunny? Well, the Gemara tells us, what do you do if Yom Tov, Pesach or any other Yom Tov begins Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night? So you have to make Havdalah and you have to make Kiddush. And so what's the order and how do you do it? And they discuss several possibilities. The conclusion they come to is we have a mnemonic which is called Yak Nahaz, Yud Kuf Nun He Zayin. What it stands for is Yayin, you say Bori Pri Hagafen. Kuf for Kiddush, you say the rest of Kiddush. Nun for Ner, that's the Borei Murei Ha'esh of Havdalah. Hey for Havdalah, you recite the Havdalah. And Zayin for Zman, the Shehechiyanu. And that's the order in which Havdalah is kind of integrated with Kiddush. Okay, so how do you remember that? Yak Nahaz. If you live in a German-speaking country, how do you remember Yak Nahaz? So many old German Haggadot have pictures of hare hunters chasing hares. Why is that? In German, that's not even a Jewish activity, let alone it's not kosher. German for hunt the hare is Jag dem Has, hunt the hare. So and you'll see this on the page in the Haggadah with Kiddush and Havdalah in it, to remind you of the order of events in that case. Yak Nahaz, Jag dem Has. Okay, that's a cute story to begin with, then it grows from there. So the Augsburg Haggadah had two pictures side by side, woodcuts. This is around 1525, I think it was the year of publication. The first picture shows the hunter and his dogs chasing the hares into a net, which looks like a hockey goal. And you think they're about to get caught and killed. The second picture shows the hares slipping under the net out the other side. One of the hares looks back over its shoulder and sees the dogs getting caught in the net instead of them. This is Kriyat Yamsuf, right? The Jews went through, the Israelites went through on dry land, and the Egyptians went after them, and the water closed up over them. And there are no captions to these pictures in the Haggadah. You couldn't say this out loud. You get in trouble with the censors, but Hamevin Yevin, right? Those who understood these little drawings were telling you, we hope that these people who are giving us such a horrible time would get off our backs, and that we're the hares and they're the dogs. Okay, so that works with Jag dem Has, with the German. But the problem is, there's an earlier example, and it's not German. It's not from a German-speaking country. So this requires further explanation. These pictures are from the Barcelona Haggadah, which is about 200 years earlier. On the right, you can see Avadim Hayinu, the Jewish slaves climbing the ladder to build the tower. On the top, the hare sitting on a throne, being served a cup of wine by a bowing dog. And on the left, part of Borei Morei Ha'esh from Havdalah. Here's the hare in a fancy cloak with a fancy border on it, controlling or hitting a dog with a stick, while the pig, dressed very modestly with her hair covered in a long dress, is serving him a cup of wine. What in the world is going on here? This is not Yag Demhas. This is from Barcelona in Spain, not from Germany. So this took a while to figure out. And I looked it up. What do you call a hare in Spanish? Liebre. What does that sound like? If you know high school Spanish. Recognize liebre in Spanish sounds like libre, free. As it says at the top here, avadim hayinu, right? This is our liberation. Now again, you couldn't say these things openly, but it's clear that there's been a reversal of roles, and the persecuted, pursued hare is now the king. And it's tempting to think that in Spain, maybe in the 14th century, the hare, the dog, and the pig might stand for Jew, Christian, and Muslim. I don't know. No one was going to say this out loud, but it's certainly tempting to think that there was a pun going on there. Libre and liebre in Spanish as well. Okay, if you are interested in this sort of thing, there are a couple of things you can do. Oh, come on, there we go. We're going to skip that. We don't have time for that. Okay, so my website, torahflora.org. You can look on the Haggadah page for more information. If you click on the Buy Now symbol there, it'll take you to the publisher's page where you can click through the image and see 10 sample pages if you like it. If you want to hear more about this sort of thing, you're welcome to email me or put your email in the chat there. And I can let you know about my events. I'm offering a discount on a Seder set of these. And also if you purchase it, I will, or come on my email list, I can send you Seder tips, how to use this Haggadah without lecturing and have a lot of fun with it. Well, someone put a question in the chat, which came first, this Yag Demhas or the Easter Bunny. Easter Bunny is much older. The word East is interesting. Easter is a holiday that has no name. Easter is related to the word estrus and estrogen. It refers to the mating season for rabbits in the spring. I think we're done with that, right? No, okay, let's get that off of there. In every other European language except English, the name for Easter is the same as the name for Passover, Pesach, something like that. Okay, so that's much older, and it refers to sort of spring and animal kinds of things. It's not really about this. So, okay, Sandy, if you send me your email, I can send you that as well. Okay, you can send it to me or just put it in the chat. I'll get everything from there. Okay, let's take some questions.
I had a question, Dr. Greenberg. It's Rabbi Weinstock.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had any ethnobotanical notes or unified theory regarding kitniyot.
Oh boy, kitniyot. Well, I can tell you a little bit of where it came from, but
Okay.
I think there's an argument to be made that it's as valid a concern now as it ever was. The Vilna Gaon pointed out that there is an antecedent to this before it became popular in Europe. There is a story in the Gemara about someone who was concerned. The custom was, and still is in some parts of the world, that employers provide lunch for their employees. And somebody had non-Jewish workers, Jewish workers, and he was giving them a kind of a bean paste to eat for lunch during Pesach, and somebody in the Gemara questions him about, it looks like it's like, oatmeal or something, some kind of a grain. You really shouldn't give them that bean paste during Pesach. People are going to think you're giving them chametz. It's not recorded what his response was or anything ever came of it, but we can see there were people who were concerned about this. A couple of factors, probably two main factors, led to development of this practice in Europe, it was developed primarily as a folk practice. It did not come down from above. It was not a rabbinic edict initially. That was sort of ratified by rabbis later. But two major factors. One is the influence of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. So that's a medieval pietistic movement whose policy was to yotze mikol hadayot, that whenever there's a range of opinions, you want to try to follow all of them if you can, including the strictest. And so they began to encourage things like this. The other is there was a change in agricultural practices. The earlier Mediterranean agricultural system used in Europe from Roman times was the two-field system. You had two fields, and you would alternate every year. One you grew and the other you left fallow, and that was fine in places that had a dry season and didn't have enough water to grow all of them all the time. The problem was, so in alternate years, if you grew, let's say, wheat in one alternation and then beans in the next, that's 3 years later. So anything that left over, that wheat that fell to the ground during harvest and might have sprouted, would have sprouted the previous year, and it's gone now. So it's very unlikely that any wheat is going to accidentally get it into your beans. But what happened later in the Middle Ages was that a new system developed in the more fertile areas of France and Germany, which was a 3-field system, and you rotated it more intensively, and you grew something in that plot 2 years out of 3. So now there was a very good chance that you're growing beans in a plot that the previous year was planted to wheat, and you could very well have some stray wheat that got on there and sprouted, and you got a few wheat grains in your beans. So the possibility of contamination increased for that system. Now, and one of the concerns also was that these burlap sacks that were used to pack the produce, the wheat grains or the dry beans or whatever, might be reused, and there'd be some broken wheat grains in there, gets in with your beans. So we don't do that anymore. Today, the grain is shipped in railroad cars, but the same concern applies. A railroad car also can be contaminated. And in fact, it's interesting that when the OU began to give a Pesach Hechsher to quinoa in South America, they only gave it to farms located in non-grain growing areas. So there was no possibility that those railroad cars would be used to ship, let's say, wheat or corn, and then turn right around and come back and get beans, get quinoa, right? So they were preventing that kind of a concern. So I think all the issues that started this off are still there. The technology is different. It's not burlap sacks anymore. It's not those agricultural systems anymore. But I think it's still a legitimate concern today. If people don't like it, it's one of those targets people like to take shots at. But I think if you're really fair about it, there are things to be concerned about there.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? I'm copying these email addresses down here. Let's see. In Miami.
Dr. Greenberg, can I ask you an autobiographical question?
Okay.
I'm wondering how you got interested in this area. Obviously, you spent a lot of time and effort and studying in this. I'm just curious.
Well, so it started out when I was in grad school and learning agronomy, and it was a Shemitah year, so I saw a few things about that. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if there's anything I can do here. And then someone gave me a book, Noga Haruveni, who is the founder of Neo Kudumim. Some of you may have visited there in Israel, Biblical Gardens in Israel. So he wrote a series of books which were translated into English, and someone gave me one. It's called Nature and Our Biblical Heritage, I think was the title. And I was fascinated by it. And the more I learned, I said, this is really pshat. This is not just some eccentric, side footnote. This is really essential to understanding so many areas of Torah that really don't make sense to people unless they have the background like this. So I began reading more about it. And then a few years ago, let's see, it was around, must have been about 15, 16 years ago, I guess I started giving talks about it. And it just kind of grew. And it started out with an email newsletter and talks to the local library. And I said, I'm not sure why I'm doing this exactly, but I want to keep going. And it grew into, my son made me a website, and I learned some more. And then I was trying to write a different book, and someone said, you really should write a Hagadah. the outline already exists, right? It's the Hagadah. And that was the project. So I spent about 4 years working on it, mostly during my commute. So I put an acknowledgement on the front thanking the MTA, New Jersey Transit, for providing a place for this to take place. Okay, someone's asking about why peanuts are considered kidney oat, even though they're not related. Right, so kidney oat is not a botanical category. I mean, people will say it's legumes. That's not entirely true. It's true that beans are legumes in the legume family. Sesame is kidney oat, and it's not a legume. It's things that are similar enough that there might be some confusion, or they might be shipped in the same containers. Any potential for confusion. So it's not a specific family of plants or anything like that. Okay, let's put other questions in here. Why delicious charoset if it's supposed to be mortar? Ah, that's a great story. That's worth mentioning. Okay, so one of the things I came up with when I was writing this is there's a pattern in the history of Jewish food. Anything bad that happened or that almost happened and we're relieved didn't happen becomes a dessert, right? Think about Purim, all the different kinds of Purim sweets. It's all about the thing that almost happened to us. There are over 15 different Purim delicacies, Purim sweets, representing different parts of Haman's body, including, I'll show you one here that actually I like to say this is the only Hagadah that comes with chametz. Let's get this picture here. This is called Einei Haman. Okay, Einei Haman, Haman's eyes. This is a Moroccan challah made especially for Purim. It's a challah with all kinds of seeds and flavors in there. You can see a border of almonds around the edge. And then there are 2 hard-boiled eggs. I dyed them red just for fun. And they're held in with crisscrosses of dough. So what you do is when you bring this to the table, before you even wash, somebody grabs the eggs and rips them out of there. And those were Haman's eyes. So this seems to be a huge pattern. And we find many, many examples. Some of you are familiar with these little sesame candies, little hard blocks of, they're basically sesame seeds embedded in a hardened syrup. They're popular in Israel. All right. So in Greece and Italy, they call those Haman's fleas. There's a cake with a hard-boiled egg embedded in it called Haman's foot. Like that's his ankle joint, I guess. They would play cards and gamble. And the winner got this little cake. There's a braided challah that looks like a rope for a noose. That's Haman's noose. Every different Haman's nails. There's all kinds of things. In Italy, there was a time when many poor Jews were tenant farmers. They were farmers that had to pay rent, and when they couldn't pay the rent, the landlord would come around with a big club and threaten them with it and evict them. So sefrati are clubs in Italian, and they make the Italian Jews have a sefrati are a kind of a sort of like a long rogalon, but it's filled with nuts. It's like a long cruller filled with nuts. It's meant to, or like a strudel, I guess, represent these clubs. So, in the bad old days, they would beat us up with clubs. So now we eat these cakes and we call them clubs. That seems to be the pattern. So charoset is part of that. I mean, it has other meanings too, but it's definitely part of this pattern that anything bad, we make it into a dessert. We celebrate that it's not happening to us now. Let's see, other questions in the chat here. Someone has that. I'm gonna have to get all these email addresses down. I will do that. Okay, we answered that. What jobs have you held in agronomy and agriculture? Well, I was in research at Cornell. I did a postdoctoral research fellowship at the USDA Plant Nutrition Lab at Cornell on trying to improve the nutritional quality of soybeans. We were studying how they make their amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and trying to find a way to make them more nutritious. And I did some research on another soybean-related project that had to do with a protein in the cell wall that we were interested in that might be similar to the way collagen functions in animals, that this protein might be a similar elastic protein in plants. That was my last job before I gave up on research and went into education. Sesame candies during Pesach, what's for that? Well, if they're Ashkenazim, they probably shouldn't be eating those sesame candies during Pesach. Apparently you saw somebody doing it, Amelia. So I have no explanation for these people. You have to ask them. Tell us more about the Hagadah. So this is the way it's organized. You have the whole Hagadah in there in Hebrew and English. And then these little essays are sort of spread throughout, explaining the natural history, the agriculture, the food history behind each part of it. There's a lot of interesting things that emerge from this. There's a sort of an opposition between lettuce and arugula, which is another alternative for karpas, because old lettuces had this sort of narcotic substance. It was used instead of aspirin, really replaced it. But up until the 1930s, you could buy a lettuce extract for pain relief and for fever reduction. And that was to help you sleep if you were sick. And on the other side was arugula. It's a little spicy, so it was thought to wake people up. And it was considered something of an aphrodisiac for that reason. The result was that from Roman times up through at least the Middle Ages and possibly later in Italy, there are records of this. When people made a salad for a dinner party, depending who the guests were and what they were like and what the host's intentions were, they had to mix the lettuce with the arugula so things didn't get out of hand. The lettuce to calm them down, the arugula to get a little racy. I realized I was getting too deeply involved in this. I teach at a Jewish high school in New York during the week, and I went into the cafeteria one day and was looking at the salad bar. I saw a big bowl of arugula and called out to no one in particular, "What are you doing? You're feeding arugula to teenagers." No one had an idea what I was talking about, and of course it's ridiculous, it doesn't really do that. But these beliefs persist and they influence people's choice of vegetables. In fact, arugula was banned in monasteries for that reason. Let's see. So that Haggadah is full of stories like this. I try to find, wherever I can connect something with that. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much. I just ordered my copy of your Haggadah. You should have it by Shabbos. I'm
Great.
looking forward to reading through it.
Great. I'm gonna, if you can leave this on for a little while, I'll copy down these email addresses that were put in the chat.
Sure.
And okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun. And I hope you have a great Pesach. And if you join this email list, I will send you Seder tips. And if you want to buy a set of 4 or more Haggadahs for your Seder, let me know. I'll send you a discount code that you can use when you order it from the publisher. Okay, it doesn't work on Amazon. It works on an order from the publisher. Okay, I think we
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna just write these down then.